And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. Just as a show of hands, I'd be interested to know how many of you believe you don't get enough sleep. That for whatever reason, whether it's health conditions, environmental factors, age, what have you, you're just not sleeping as well and getting enough sleep as you think you should. And I would think that the vast majority of us would say that we fall into that category. But I want us to think about the other problem, the other side of that coin for just a minute. And that is the idea that it's possible to get too much sleep. I would guess that you're probably thinking, how is that even a problem? Is that even possible? But it's interesting that scientific studies now show that there are great dangers associated with oversleeping. That is, most doctors would tell you that the optimum amount of sleep is probably 7 to 8 hours a night. But for people that are sleeping more than that, and then maybe napping during the day, that can cause severe medical problems, including but not limited to depression, anxiety, obesity, stroke, diabetes, and heart disease. If we sleep too much, it's just as bad, if not worse, than if we're not sleeping enough. And that's what we want to think about a bit this morning as we continue our series, The Letter to the Seven Churches. Moving now into Revelation chapter 3, where God, writing through the Apostle John, addresses the church in Sardis. Sardis, like the other churches we have mentioned during our discussions, was once a part of ancient Greece, but is now a part of modern-day Turkey. It was not a coastal town. It was inland and very close to the other churches that we've been talking about. In this letter, in this address to the church at Sardis, it's a little different than the other ones because there really is no good news. In his other letter to the churches, John always starts off with some kind of good news, commendation. This is what you're doing well. We don't see that in this letter to the church at Sardis. It goes right into the difficult news or the criticism. And specifically, we see that in verses 1 through 3. You have the reputation of being alive, we read, but you are dead. Wake up. Strengthen what remains and is about to die, because your deeds are unfinished. And that idea of waking up is what we want to think about more this morning, and specifically how it applies to us in our modern day circumstances. I think one way to get to that is to focus on this idea of sleep. If we're told to wake up, we must be sleeping. What do we associate with sleep? What are some of the things we associate with the concepts of sleep? One would be inactivity. I have yet to meet the person that can accomplish something while they are asleep. When you're asleep, you are almost totally inactive except for involuntary body movements. You're not doing anything. You are unable to produce any work. And the Bible addresses this idea of inactivity quite strongly and quite clearly, especially in the Old Testament, and even more particularly in the book of Proverbs. For example, in Proverbs 21, 25, and 26, we read about the craving of the sluggard, which leads to death, to crave more and more inactivity and laziness. And that's contrasted with the righteous, whom we read, it says, give without sparing. So you can see the criticism of inactivity here, as we also see in 2 Thessalonians 3:6, where Paul specifically admonishes the church at Thessalonica to keep away from idle believers, to stay away from them, and to follow the example that Paul and the other apostles set for them. Paul goes on to say, we worked while we were among you. We took care of ourselves. We did not simply come and take charity. So you can see the criticism of the inactive and the lazy, both in the Old Testament and the New. The second thing we could say about sleep is that it is typically done in darkness. The darker the better as far as I'm concerned. Unless I'm very, very tired, I find it hard to sleep in a lit room. And I have gone so far as to wear a sleep mask to increase the darkness, which promotes sleep. But again, this idea of darkness, and especially spiritual darkness, is talked about at length in the Bible and condemned. It is associated, of course, with the evil one, the darkness of the evil one, Satan. And we are specifically warned against falling into that darkness. In Romans 13, verses 12 and 13, Paul goes on to tell us that we should put aside the deeds of darkness, the things that are done under the cover of night, done in darkness so no one else can see them. We should put aside the deeds of darkness, that kind of evil, and put on the armor of light. So again, a specific condemnation of spiritual darkness in our lives. So sleep is associated with inactivity and darkness, and finally with dreaming. I don't know about you, but I dream a lot when I sleep. The problem was so acute when I was younger that I actually walked in my sleep for a period of time. And there's all kinds of scientific studies about dreams and dreaming and dream interpretation and what it means. But as just one example of how that's approached, look at what we read in Ecclesiastes 5:7. Much dreaming, Solomon writes, is meaningless. Dreaming is meaningless. And therefore we should fear God. Now, there's all kinds of dreams in the Bible, and God imparted dreams and spoke to people in dreams. That's not the kind of dreaming Solomon's talking about. He's talking about the kind of idle dreaming, say, of what we want to do with our lives, or what we would do if we were rich, or what we would do if we could lead a life of leisure. That's the kind of dreaming he's talking about. A dreaming related to fantasy and idleness. So you can see the three main components, the ideas we associate with sleep, inactivity, darkness, and dreams, are all specifically condemned in a spiritual sense in the Bible. So if that's what's going on with sleep, the opposite of that must be being awake. And that's what we see, of course, in our reading this morning in Revelations. We are told to wake up. Wake up. Well, what's associated with being awake? Well, obviously, it would be the opposite of what's associated with sleep. So instead of inactivity, it would be activity, doing things. Doing things, especially in a spiritual sense, for the Lord. That's why, for example, Paul writes in Colossians 3:23, whatever you do, do it, work at it, with all your heart as for the Lord, because you will receive your inheritance from the Lord as a reward. Whatever you do, do it with all your heart. Be active. Be doing something. Not just idle work, but work for the Lord. If darkness is associated with sleep, then being awake is associated with light. And we know that Jesus is the light of the world. The light as contrasted with the darkness of evil and of Satan. That's discussed at length in John chapter 1. In verse 5, we read, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Christ is that light that shines in us and shines in our hearts and overcomes the evil of darkness, the evil of Satan. It is the light that dispels the darkness and the light that overcomes the evil. And finally, this idea of dreams. We made the point that there's a difference between our dreaming and God's speaking to us through dreams. Solomon suggests that our dreaming is simply idle fantasy. But God very much can communicate and talk to us in dreams, as he did for quite a few people in the Bible. And we read in Joel 2:28, which talks about God pouring out his Spirit upon his people. The old men will dream dreams, and the young men will see visions. Those dreams are from God, communication from God, and thus are distinguished from the kind of idle dreams that we engage in as part of our sinful nature. So where's all this going? This idea of sleep and being awake, especially for us as individuals and for us as a congregation. Well, as individuals, the idea of waking up, of rising from spiritual slumber, is about preparing for the return of Jesus Christ. Living our lives as though Jesus would return at any moment. That's the point of all those parables Jesus spoke in Matthew about the 10 lamps and the 10 virgins and being ready, being prepared. There will be some who will be ready and some who will not because they're asleep. They're asleep at the switch. They're not ready. They don't believe that the situation necessitates them being prepared. They are living their lives as if Jesus will never return. And therefore, they are caught unaware when he does. And even if Jesus does not return in our lifetimes, we still must face spiritual death, or physical death rather, which could come at any time for any of us. No one knows the day or the hour at which point our lives will end. Are we living our lives in such a way as to prepare for that and to acknowledge that that could happen at any moment? But the other part of this is the idea of what does this mean for us as a congregation to wake up and to finish those deeds that are unfinished. I think in a very real sense, our congregation faces a tremendous danger of spiritual sleep, of putting things on spiritual autopilot. That is, letting things just go along and bump along and not worry about it because the church will just kind of take care of itself. When we are told to wake up as a congregation, we are being told, like the church in Sardis, to take an active role in our congregation. Not to just put it on autopilot, not to just turn it over to someone else, but to take an active role in growing this church, serving this church, and moving this congregation forward. An interesting thought about this concept of autopilot. There was an article that appeared in New Yorker magazine not too long ago that suggested that autopilot in an airplane can actually be dangerous and can lead to increased accidents. Why? Because it teaches people to do something that is inherently hard for them to do, and that is to sit back and watch and do nothing. Autopilot teaches us to sit around and be idle. And now we're applying that same concept to cars. I'm sure you've seen the commercials with the self-driving cars that will park themselves. I'm not saying this is necessarily a bad development, but I do agree with the article in the sense that it teaches us to do something that's contradictory to our nature, and that's to stand around and watch and do nothing. And it's exactly the same in a spiritual sense. It's exactly the same for our congregation. Putting the church on autopilot, assuming that it's going to run itself, assuming that other people will take charge and take control, is dangerous because it creates and instills a situation in us where we are conditioned to just sit around and watch. Like the church in Sardis, we must get off our hands. We must wake up and finish our unfinished business. We must take this congregation off autopilot. We must take all of us must take a more active role. And instead of standing around and figuring out or thinking that will take care of itself or someone will take care of it for us, our attitude needs to be one of, what can I do? How can I help? How can I take part? And at the very basic, bare minimum, this starts with consistent church attendance every Sunday, consistent attendance in Sunday school and at Bible study. That's the starting point. That is the basic, bare minimum starting point for kicking this church in the rear and getting it moving in the right direction. It all starts from that. And then we can move on to working together in ministry and to reaching out and to spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. There are unfortunately, a lot of parallels between the church at Sardis and the church here in Shelby County. Let us take this admonition to heart. Wake up from your spiritual slumber. Wake up and let us together finish the unfinished business that God has called us to. Listen to the words of Paul from Ephesians 5:14. Wake up, sleeper, and rise from the dead, and the light of Christ will shine upon you. Amen.